She was 19 years old and the last unmarried child on a ranch her family had already begun to lose. And she owned in the world one good saddle, one bone-handled folding knife her grandfather had carried out of Missouri, and $42 in silver rolled into a sock at the bottom of her trunk. Her name was Grace Ward, and the country she rode was called Dry Creek, and by the summer of her 19th year, the men who held the paper on her father's water had begun to press the Ward brand off its own range, the way a man presses a thumb into soft clay, slowly, and without ever raising his voice. Grace had grown up expecting to endure that pressing the way her mother had endured it, and her mother's mother before her, quietly, without argument, because that was what women in that country were understood to do. But out past the last fence her father still bothered to mend, in a shallow bowl of sun-bleached ground that appeared on no county map and no surveyor's plat, there stood a field of low stone walls older than any deed in the territory, and beneath one of those walls lay a sealed chamber, and inside that chamber lay the reason those men had never truly wanted the Ward Valley for its grass. Settle in and stay with me a while, and let me know down in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, because this is a long story, and it deserves the slow telling, and if you would like to hear more like it, take a moment to subscribe before we ride out with her. What Grace Ward found under those stones would turn a girl expected to swallow loss into the one person in 3 counties who could hand it back, and it would do so without her ever raising her voice either, because she had been taught by a patient man to move the way water moves when it finds a crack, steady and certain and altogether unhurried. That is the story I mean to tell you now, from the beginning, in the order it happened, so that when we come to the chamber and the letter inside it, you will understand why a 19-year-old girl with $42 and a folding knife was the one the country had been waiting on all those quiet years without knowing it. Grace had been born in a slab-sided ranch house 11 miles north of the settlement they called Dry Creek, the 4th of 5 children and the only daughter. On a night her father later said was so cold the wash water froze in the basin before her mother had finished with her. Her father, Thomas Ward, was a lean, careful man who had come west from Tennessee at 17 with a borrowed rifle and a saddle he had made himself, and who had spent the following 32 years building a small cattle outfit at the dry edge of the mountains on land nobody else had wanted when he first put a stake in it. Her mother, Ruth, was a Missouri farmer's daughter who could set a broken finger, deliver a calf, keep books in a clean copperplate hand, and had lost 2 infants between Grace and her youngest brother without ever once permitting herself the indulgence of open grief. Grace's 3 older brothers were all grown and gone by the time she was 12, 2 to the mines up in the Silver Range, and 1 to a wife and a homestead over the divide. And the youngest, a slow-spoken boy named Micah, was still at home only because a horse had rolled on him at 14 and left him with a stiff hip that made long riding a torment. That left Grace, from about the age of 13 forward, doing the work of a grown son on a place her father was too proud to admit was slipping. She could rope, cut, brand, doctor a wormy calf, shoe a gentle horse, mend wire, sight a rifle, drive a wagon through country that had no road, and she could do all of it without saying more than the situation required. What she could not yet do was the one thing the country was preparing to require of her, which was to look at a piece of ground everyone else considered worthless and see clearly what it was for. That skill she had begun to learn from an old man named Ephraim Hollis, a widowed line rider who had worked her father's North Range for 18 winters, and who had, without ever meaning to, taught Grace almost everything of consequence she knew. Ephraim Hollis died in the last week of April, quietly, in the line shack on the north bench where he had spent most of his winters, and Grace was the one who found him. She had ridden up with a sack of flour and a tin of coffee, expecting to sit an hour by his stove and listen to him name the birds that had come back over the pass, and instead she had found him laid out neat on his bunk with his boots off and his hands folded, as though he had known the hour and had not wanted to trouble anyone with the disorder of it. She buried him herself, with Micah holding the reins of the pack mule in a shallow bench of stony ground above the shack where he had once told her the wind kept the snow thin. She did not cry then, and she did not cry on the ride down. What she carried back with her, wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas, was his brass compass, the glass scratched almost blind, and a folded plat map he had drawn himself of the country north of the last fence, on which he had marked, in a careful pencil hand, a set of small squares in the shallow bowl beyond the boundary, and written beside them only the word walls. It was 3 weeks after that burial, on a Tuesday in the middle of May, that the paper came. A man Grace did not know, in a black coat too heavy for the season, rode up to the ranch house at midday and asked for Thomas Ward by his given name and handed him a folded document without dismounting. He waited only long enough to see Thomas open it, touched his hat brim, and rode back down the wagon track without taking the water that had been offered. Thomas read the paper twice at the kitchen table with his reading spectacles pushed low on his nose and then set it down and looked out the window for a long minute at the corral where Micah was working a colt on a lead. The paper was from a firm in the county seat that represented the men who held the note on the Ward water rights, and it said, in language so mild it took a second reading to hear the blade in it, that the note had matured, that no further extension would be entertained, that the undersigned would take possession of the water and the improvements attendant upon it on the 1st day of July, and that the family occupying the residence would be permitted, as a courtesy, to remove their personal effects and such loose stock as they could drive before that date. It was signed in 3 places. It did not raise its voice. It did not need to. Ruth read it after Thomas and folded it back along its creases and put it in the drawer where she kept the almanac, and then she went out to the yard and took down the washing so the wind would not carry it into the sage. Thomas sat at the table a while longer. Then he stood up and went to the barn and did not come out until supper. Nobody spoke of the paper at the meal. Micah asked once whether the colt should be turned out with the mares, and Thomas answered him, and that was the whole of the talk. Grace lay awake that night in the small room off the kitchen that had been hers since she was 7, and she listened to the house settle in the cold. And she thought about the plat map folded in her saddlebag and the pencil word walls written in Ephraim Hollis's hand, and sometime before dawn she got up and dressed. She put her $42 in silver into the sock and the sock into the inside pocket of her coat. She put the bone-handled folding knife her grandfather had carried out of Missouri into her belt. She wrapped a day's bread and a paper of salt pork and a tin cup into a flour sack and tied the sack to the back of her saddle. She took the brass compass with the scratched glass and the folded plat, and she wrote a short note to her mother saying only that she had gone up past the last fence for 2 nights and would be back by the 3rd, and she left the note under the salt cellar where Ruth would find it at breakfast. She saddled the good bay mare in the dark by feel and led her out past the corral so the gate would not wake the house. When she swung up, the eastern rim of the sky was the color of skim milk, and the air smelled of cold sage and of the wood smoke that had gone out in the kitchen stove hours before. She rode north at a walk until she was past the barn, and then she picked up a long trot, and she did not look back at the house until she had crossed the first coulee, and by then the house was only a low black shape against the paler ground. No window lit, no dog barking, nothing to say she had ever been in it at all. The country between the ranch and the last fence was 11 miles of broken sage flat cut by 3 shallow washes, and Grace knew every foot of it by heart, and yet she watched it that morning as though she had never crossed it before. She noted the antelope that lifted their heads at her passing and let them go again without spooking. She noted the way the sun, when it came up over the eastern rim, laid a long red light along the tops of the greasewood and left the hollows in blue shadow, and she noted the way the mare's shoulders warmed under her hand as the miles took the stiffness out of them. The wind rose about an hour after sunrise, dry and steady out of the west, and she pulled her hat down and turned her collar up and rode into it. She reached the last fence a little before noon. It was a 3-wire fence her father had strung 20 years earlier and mended every spring since, and the posts were juniper cut from the little draws to the west, and the wire was rusted the color of old blood but still sound. She stepped down and unhooked the gate wire from its loop and led the mare through and hooked it back, because Thomas Ward had raised her to close a gate whether or not there was anyone behind her to see it. Then she mounted again and rode out of the country that had a deed on it and into the country that did not. Beyond the fence the ground fell away in a long shallow tilt toward the bowl Ephraim Hollis had marked on his plat, and the sage thinned, and the soil went from brown to a pale bone color, and there were no tracks in it, but the small crossings of coyote and jackrabbit and the wandering print of a single mule deer. She rode another 2 hours at a walk, letting the mare pick her line among the shale, and she watched the horizon for the low, broken shapes that ought, if the plat was true, to lift above the flat ahead of her. When at last they came up out of the ground, they came up slowly, first as a change in the line of the far rim, then as a scatter of dark shoulders no higher than a kneeling man, and then, as she rode closer, as walls. She rode down into the bowl at a walk, and the walls came up around her by degrees, the way a herd of bedded cattle comes up out of long grass when a rider is close enough to count them. There were, when she had ridden the full circuit of them once, 9 walls she could still call walls, and the buried lines of perhaps 6 more, and together they laid out a rough oval, maybe 80 paces long and 40 across, with 2 inner divisions that had been rooms once, and were now only shallow rectangles marked by set stones. The stones were pale gray, of a kind she did not know from her father's country, cut square and fitted without mortar, and the largest of them was as long as her forearm and as thick as her hand. Nothing about them was ranch work. Nothing about them was even white men's work as she had ever seen it. They had been set by people who had time and knew what they were doing and did not expect to leave. Grace stepped down and dropped the bay's reins and let her stand. She walked the perimeter first, because Ephraim Hollis had taught her that a man who ran into a strange place before he had gone around it was a man who left something at his back he had not counted. The tallest wall stood a little under her shoulder and ran for about 15 paces along what she took, from the sun, to be the eastern side. It was the wall Ephraim's plat had marked with a small, careful cross in pencil. The face of it was weathered smooth and streaked with the pale gray of old lichen, and at its base, where wind had scoured the soil away over what she guessed was a long span of years, she could see the tops of larger stones set below the surface, like the shoulders of something buried up to its neck. She knelt and put her hand on the eastern wall and felt how cold the stone was even in the noon sun, and she went along it slowly on her knees, brushing the dust away from the base with the flat of her palm. About 2/3 of the way down the wall, her hand passed over a joint that was not like the others. The stones on either side of it were fitted flush and dry, as all the stones were, but this joint was filled with a paler grit that crumbled under her thumbnail. She picked at it with the point of Ephraim's map pencil, and the grit came away in a thin trickle, and beneath it there was a second joint, and the second joint outlined a slab about the size of a wagon seat board set flat into the base of the wall. She stood up and stepped back and looked at the slab, and then at the shallow rectangle of ground behind the wall, which lay a hand's breadth lower than the ground outside it. She understood, standing there in the wind with the mare's breath sounding behind her, that whatever chamber Ephraim Hollis had drawn on his plat was under her feet, and that the slab in the wall was not a wall stone at all, but a door laid on its side. She sat down in the dust at the foot of the wall and drank a swallow of water from her canteen and ate a piece of the salt pork and half the bread, because she had been raised by a mother who did not let her go hungry into work. And then she took her grandfather's bone-handled knife out of her belt and opened it and began, patiently, to clean the last of the packed grit out of the seam around the slab. It took her the better part of 2 hours. She worked the knife point along one side and then the other, and when the seam was clear she cut a length of the mare's picket rope and worked one end down behind the slab, and hitched the other to her saddle horn, and led the mare a step at a time, away from the wall, until the slab tipped forward out of its bed and lay down flat in the dust, with a small dry sound, like a book closing. Behind it was a hollow, no bigger than the mouth of a root cellar, and behind that hollow was a stair of 3 shallow steps, cut into the stone, going down into dark. She lit the stub of tallow candle she had brought in a fold of paper and shielded it with her palm and went down the 3 steps and stood in a room she could nearly touch the roof of. It was perhaps 6 paces long and 3 across, floored with dry sand, and along its far wall, stood a low bench of the same pale gray stone. On the bench sat three things: a small iron-bound box the size of a family Bible, a leather satchel gone stiff and gray, and laid across the top of them both, a folded oilskin packet tied with a piece of black ribbon. The air was dry and smelled only of stone and old leather. Nothing moved. Nothing had moved in there, she thought, for a long while. She set the candle on the bench and untied the ribbon with fingers that had gone careful and slow. Inside the oilskin was a sheaf of papers, and folded on top of the sheaf was a letter of 4 pages written in a spare, even hand in brown ink. She read the first line by the tallow light, and then sat down on the bottom step of the stair and read the whole of it through without stopping. My name is Josiah Renner. I was a freighter out of Independence, and later a packer for the survey parties that came into this basin in the years before the war, and for 11 winters I kept a shack a day's ride south of where you are sitting now. If you have found this room, you have followed either my map or another man's, and either way you are owed the truth of what these walls were used to hold. The men who called themselves the Basin Company hired me in my second winter to carry gold dust and coin out of a placer they had no title to, and to bring it here, and to lay it under this bench, because they did not trust one another and did trust the ground. I carried for them 4 years. In the 5th year, they took my mules and my wages and left me at a station with a broken leg, and I understood then what they were, and I came back to this room alone in the fall and took what was owed me and left the rest, and I wrote out on the papers under this letter every name and every claim and every date I had carried for them, so that whoever came after would have in their hand what I did not. I am leaving in the box $840 in coin, which is my share and no more. I am leaving the ledger, which is worth to the right person more than the coin. I knew a man in Missouri named Ward who lent me a rifle when I had none, and if any child of his ever stands in this room, I hope it is with better luck than I had, and a steadier hand. Grace laid the letter down on her knee and sat a long while in the small dry room with the candle burning between her boots. She stayed under the ground until the candle burned down to a nub, and then she pinched it out, put the stub back in its paper, and carried the iron-bound box and the oilskin packet and the stiff leather satchel up the 3 shallow steps into the afternoon light. She set the slab back into its bed of grit with the picket rope and the mare's steady weight, tamped the seam with dust and gravel until it looked no different from any other joint in the wall, and marked the place in her own memory by counting paces from the tallest juniper on the western rim. She rode out of the bowl at a walk, with the box wrapped in her spare shirt and lashed behind the cantle, and she was back through the last fence by the middle of the following morning, and at the kitchen table by dusk of the day after that, with the ledger open in front of her father and her mother and Micah, and the $840 in coin stacked in 4 short columns between the sugar bowl and the lamp. Thomas Ward read Josiah Renner's ledger the way he had once read the paper from the county seat, twice through and without moving his lips, and when he was done, he laid his hand flat on the top page and said only that 3 of the names written there were the same 3 names printed on the note against his water. Ruth put the coffee on. Grace slept 8 hours for the first time in a month. They rode into the county seat on the following Monday, Grace and Thomas Ward and Micah on the good mule, with the ledger wrapped in oilskin inside a flour sack inside a saddlebag. They put up at a boarding house kept by a woman named Alma Peake, 51 years old, widowed of a teamster, who charged them 30 cents apiece for the night and gave Micah an extra blanket without being asked. In the morning, they walked to the office of a lawyer named Robert Wills, 44, who had done Thomas Ward's brand transfer 11 years earlier and who read the ledger through in one long silent sitting, and then rose and closed his door and said the paper on the Ward water would not survive what was written in his hands. He took a retainer of $20 from the coin and would take no more until the matter was settled. Word moved the way it moves in a small town. A clerk in the recorder's office named Henry Doak, 28, pulled the original placer filings for Robert Wills and confirmed in a whisper across the counter that no title had ever been perfected on the ground Josiah Renner named. A printer named Isaac Bream, 60, set a notice in type without charging for the composition and ran off 200 handbills for the cost of the paper. A neighbor rancher named Cornelius Otter, 57, who had lost his own north pasture to the same 3 men 4 years earlier, rode 18 miles to sign a sworn statement in Robert Wills's office and stayed to eat supper at the boarding house and would not let Thomas Ward pay for his plate. A blacksmith named William Huss, 39, reshod the good bay mare and the mule for the ride home and refused the coin Grace offered and said only that he had known Ephraim Hollis and that was enough. Grace spent 3 weeks in the county seat with the ledger. She copied it out in her mother's clean copperplate hand into a bound book Isaac Bream gave her, so that if the first went into a fire, the second would stand. She sat in the back of Robert Will's office while depositions were taken, and she answered questions in a voice quiet enough that the stenographer twice asked her to speak up and steady enough that he never asked a third time. The hearing was held on the 22nd of June in a plastered room above the recorder's office, and it lasted the better part of a day. The 3 men whose names stood at the head of Josiah Renner's ledger did not appear in person. Their attorney appeared, listened, asked for a recess at 11, and did not return in the afternoon. The judge, a spare gray man named Albert Munn, 63, read the ledger entries aloud into the record for 1 full hour, set aside the note against Thomas Ward's water as founded on funds unlawfully taken and unlawfully lent, and ordered the recorder to strike the encumbrance from the book. He then adjourned and, on his way out, touched the brim of his hat to Grace, where she sat on the end of the bench with the oilskin packet on her lap. They rode home the next morning with the water rights clear and the ledger locked in a tin box under the seat of Alma Peake's borrowed buckboard. Thomas Ward drove. Grace rode the bay mare alongside. Micah rode behind on the mule with his stiff hips stretched out along the pack, and he sang under his breath a hymn their mother had taught them, and neither Thomas Ward nor Grace told him to hush. The Ward Valley kept its water through the summer, and it kept its water through the fall, and by the first hard frost in October, Grace Ward was a name that men in 3 counties knew and used carefully. Cornelius Otter brought his own old ledger down from a shelf in his tack room and asked Grace to look through it with him, and Grace found in it 2 claims that could be reopened and 1 that could not, and she told him so plainly, and he thanked her and put the ledger back. A widow named Lydia Ames, 36, whose husband had died on a survey line 6 years earlier without ever being paid, rode out to the ranch in November with a bundle of her husband's papers, and Grace sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 afternoons and drew up a claim in Robert Wills's language and sent it in by mail. Word moved that way through the winter, quietly, from porch to porch and station to station, and by spring the Ward kitchen had become a place where papers were brought and read. Grace rode the North Range that first winter, as Ephraim Hollis had ridden it, and she rebuilt the line shack on the bench above his grave with Micah's help and with lumber hauled up by Willem Haas on a borrowed wagon. They set a new stove, a bunk, a shelf for a lamp and a tin of coffee, and a small square window facing east. Grace nailed a piece of tin over the door lintel with Ephraim Hollis's initials cut into it with the point of her grandfather's knife. Travelers came through the shack as they had come through in Ephraim's time, and they left small things behind them on the shelf: a paper of tea, a coil of wire, a candle, a folded note of thanks in a hand Grace did not know. In the settlement of Dry Creek itself, at the store kept by a man named Peter Ansell, 48, Grace's account was carried on a page of its own, and when she came in for flour or salt or nails, Peter Ansell called her by her name and asked after Ruth and after Micah and after the bay mare, and he wrote the totals in a column so straight that Grace, who had grown up watching her mother's books, took quiet pleasure in it. Sunday mornings Ruth set out 4 cups for coffee on the kitchen table and a 5th beside them for whoever rode in, and someone almost always did. On a Sunday morning in the second spring after the hearing, Grace Ward sat at the kitchen table in the slab-sided house 11 miles north of Dry Creek and drank the first cup of the coffee her mother had put out. The bay mare stood tied in the yard, saddled, because Grace was riding up to the line shack after breakfast to leave a sack of flour and a tin of coffee on the shelf for whoever came through next. On the table in front of her lay 2 objects. The first was the bone-handled folding knife her grandfather had carried out of Missouri, closed, the brass pin worn bright by 50 years of thumbs. The second was Ephraim Hollis's brass compass, its glass scratched almost blind, still holding true north within a hair. Beside them lay a third thing that she had begun to think of as belonging with them. The 4-page letter Josiah Renner had written by tallow light in a room beneath a stone wall and left in an oilskin packet for whoever should come. The letter was folded now along the same creases Josiah Renner had folded it along, and it was kept in the drawer with the almanac where the paper against the water had once been kept. Grace looked at the two objects and at the letter and understood, without needing to say it, that the knife and the compass and the letter were all gifts from men who had loved someone they never got to see grown. Her grandfather had died in the year she was born. Ephraim Hollis had died in April with his boots off and his hands folded. Josiah Renner had gone out of the country a lifetime before her father had first strung a wire past the last fence. None of the three had ever laid eyes on her, and each of them, in the small, careful ways men have when they know their time is thin, had left her exactly what she needed to stand where she now stood. Thomas Ward came in from the yard, hung his hat on the peg, and sat down across from her and poured his coffee. Ruth set a plate of bread between them. Micah was already at the corral, still slow on his stiff hip, working with a young horse a neighbor had sent over to be gentled because the neighbor had said, plainly and without embarrassment, that Micah Ward had a hand for it. Somewhere out on the wagon track a horse was coming in, and Ruth glanced at the 5th cup on the table without turning her head. The men who had held the paper on the Ward water were gone from the county. 2 had left in the fall after the hearing. The 3rd had stayed a while longer, and then had sold what he could sell and had gone as well, and the placer named in Josiah Renner's ledger, which had never been theirs, had been quietly closed by the recorder's office and marked on the plat with a fresh line. Cornelius Otter had his north pasture back. Lydia Ames had her husband's wages. The line shack on the bench above Ephraim Hollis's grave stood square to the wind, and in the small square east-facing window the first light of every morning fell on the shelf where the tin of coffee was kept. Grace Ward closed the knife into her palm and felt its weight and thought of the girl who had ridden out of a dark yard with $42 in a sock and a folded plaid in her coat, expecting to endure what her mother and her mother's mother had endured. Grace Ward was 19 and the last unmarried child on a ranch that had been slipping out from under her family for a year. She had $42 in silver and a bone-handled knife and a scratched brass compass to her name, and she spent them all on a 2-day ride past the last fence her father still mended. It was the best $42 and the best 2 days she ever spent. If this story sat with you the way it sat with the men and women who first told stories like it around wood stoves and kitchen tables, take a moment before you ride on. Subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you, and share this one with somebody who has been told to endure a loss quietly when they might. With a little patience and a steady hand that loss back instead. And then, before you close the window, ask yourself this: what piece of ground in your own life have you been taught to walk past because everyone around you agreed it was worthless? And what might be waiting under the stones of it for the day you finally step down, drop the reins, and kneel to brush the dust away?